Hello there, everybody. Welcome back to Star Wars Lads for our review of the second X-Wing novel from Michael Stackpole, X-Wing Wedge's Gamble. We're going to be giving you guys our non-spoiler thoughts on this novel and then talking in full spoilers about it along with the other three X-Wing Rogue Squadron novels from Stackpole on December 11th, which will be our first live Legends Book Club video. We are going to be talking about everything to do with the spoilers of these novels and taking your guys' questions and comments and really going fully into it. We have retooled Legends Book Club for longtime fans. You might have remembered it being long 30 to 45-minute videos where we talk about Legends books very in depth. We want to give you guys a chance to read along with us, make this a real book club. So we're starting this going on December 11th, talking about these four books. Hopefully you guys join us and get to discuss the novels along with us, but mark it on your calendar and subscribe for more. We do have lots of Legends coverage on the channel. If you haven't checked out our Rogue Squadron review, check that out. And we will have reviews, non-spoiler, just like this, for the other two X-Wing Rogue Squadron novels. We do have reviews out for the Wraith Squadron trilogy as well on the channel if you're interested in checking that out. All right, let's get into X-Wing Wedge's Gamble. This is the second novel in the series, and in this novel, the rogues are assigned with reclaiming Coruscant, a massive plot point and one of the biggest, most important lore points in the entirety of the X-Wing series. I'm going to pass it to you, Sanak, first for your thoughts on the plotting, the writing, and the overall story construction that Michael Stackpole has here for Wedge's Gamble. What were your thoughts?
This is the book that I struggle with the most out of the four, and this is the one I was most excited for because, like you said, this ends with the Battle of Coruscant. This is supposed to be this big, explosive moment, and it does for the first third and the final third. It's really that middle act that really, really meanders for me, and I do struggle a bit with this book. Everything to do with Kessel, with the politicking of the New Republic, kind of forcing the situation to accelerate towards Coruscant, especially now that they know Izard is kind of getting prepared for them. We don't have a big window to make this work. Yeah, that all really clicked for me, and I did like kind of going into more of a insurgency route there, a little bit more of an insertion, kind of figuring out, okay, how do we now use our other skills, not just as pilots, but as people who are going to have to fit in Coruscant, and how are we going to work with these criminals that we kind of have to release into Coruscant streets and cause a little bit of chaos that we can then exploit, right? I thought conceptually very strong. I liked everything that happened on Kessel. And then as far as the actual Battle of Coruscant, everything that is laid out in that middle act sets it up pretty well. I think it is one of the more creative battles in throughout these four books. I do like how they use and explore a lot of the Coruscant landscape, like the big icebergs that are there kind of near the poles, how they're using that to kind of fight off things like the virus, how they're trying to use it to work with the two planetary shields to deflect the huge amount of power source and surges that are coming from that, working with those big machines that are like repairing skyscrapers and everything. Like it is very, very well handled with the different moving pieces. It is really that middle act that I struggle with because I think that's where I would have expected some of the new members of the Rogue Squadron, especially Pash and Errol, to kind of play a bigger role. Pash was very disappointing for me, especially knowing who his father is, with the Kraken family name and legacy with the Intelligence Committee of the Alliance. I feel like he has a solid introduction. It's just that it doesn't really go further past that. And I found that pretty disappointing. Errol has some pretty interesting things to do, especially with the whole Krytos plot kind of being conducted and concocted in the first place, and how that's being affected and played out in Invisisec, how the rogues are kind of moving in and out, picking up pieces of history and working with these other criminals, keeping tabs on them. All that is solid to me. I have no real issue with any of that. I just find that it took a long time to get going. It wasn't that it was ever bad. There are some interesting sequences, like the speeder sequences with the bombs and everything. Like, yeah, good things are happening here, but I didn't really feel that it really did as much legwork as I would have hoped to make Battle of Coruscant feel massive, especially when you look at some like EU art and everything. It makes it seem like the Liberation is so much bigger. And it really isn't. And I think that's what disappoints me a little bit. I would have wished that there was a little bit more to it. But, I was still pretty pleased with the final twists and everything. I thought that was pretty solid. And I at least left the book with like, a strong interest in what was going to come next with the Kratos trap.
Yeah, and this is the one where you and I differ the most, because I absolutely love Wedge's Gamble. This is one of my favorite X-Wing books, and I love the way this is structured and plotted. I know that is certainly something that separates us, but it's also something I feel like is a little bit more of a hotter take around the Rogue Squadron story, because this is probably my favorite of this four of these four books. This is a book that I just think takes the formula and runs with it. It evolves it, it changes it, and it keeps it fresh. To me, one of the things I had an interest in with Rogue Squadron, but it ultimately kind of pulled it down, was the formulaic style storytelling, the Top Gun style storytelling, the focus on a Maverick versus Iceman story, the failures versus rising up. Are you too hot headed to be a part of the group? All those basic things that made it fun were also the things that made it a little less memorable. For me, Wedge's Gamble, not only does it tackle the biggest plot point in the entirety of the X-Wing series, but it also does it in a very, very different way than Rogue Squadron. The espionage element of this book, I really like. The middle act is the weakest of the three acts, but I did really enjoy the espionage elements. I think it helps pit characters with each other. You see certain dynamics grow. You also see the way certain characters evolve and change in their temperaments, the way they continue to morph into who they ultimately will become. I found a lot of the writing around that pretty interesting and pretty compelling. I also really enjoy a look at the underworld of Coruscant here. There's a lot of really seedy things about Coruscant in this book. It's maybe grosser than it's ever been, and I did actually really like that, as well as the depths that both the New Republic, but also kind of the rebellion have to go through here. Like they're New Republic in name, but they are rebellion to their core in this story. And I really liked the way you see those dirtier tactics, something you might see in an Andor or a more elevated style of rebellion story, brought in here. They're desperate. They have to do what they have to do, and I really liked that desperation, especially when you bring such a clean character like Wedge Antilles into the story and you have him doing things that might seem questionable. I appreciated that, but I also loved the look at Corrin as this agent and all these different things. You got to see so many different sides to it, and I really loved the end battle. I think it's very creative, very interesting. And then from an Imperial perspective, without giving too much away, I loved what Isar does to craft that battle. I think it's just very fascinating to me. So I really love the way this is structured. And again, I did listen to this most recently on audiobook when I did my reread, and I do highly recommend the audiobook. Once again, you're never going to hear me say a bad thing about the audiobook, but Mark Thompson does a great job with the narration. He narrates all 8 of them, and so you should definitely check it out if you're looking for a way to get into these X-Wing books. But let's get into those characters now that I was mentioning earlier. We do have, once again, the same cast of characters from the first one: Wedge Antilles, Corran Horn, Mirax. All the characters are brought over into the story, as well as Isard with an expanded role, and then Kirtan Lore coming back once again to be a foe for the Rogues. Sonic, when you look specifically at the characters in X-Wing Wedge's Gamble, what were your thoughts on some of them?
I think I find a lot of the villains to be a little bit more compelling, especially some of the contrasts. I mean, we have to start with Izard. She is fascinating. She's fully unveiled here, and you get to see why her name is Iceheart, right? Like that's why she gets the nickname. It's not just the physical appearances; it's just how ruthless and cold and manipulative, and the like level that she's going to commit even like crimes against an entire trillion plus population of Coruscant. It's really messed up, and that is what makes the book compelling for me, because anytime she's working with Kirtan and like kind of directing him around, he's always on his toes. She still catches him off guard, and then she puts him on a path to like make some really strong choices. And then what is interesting for me is that I thought that would mean that Kirtan would be a little bit of a stronger character for me in this book, and he has his moments, but I thought it was more that contrast with him and Derek, him kind of being brought in from that first book, and you find out just how much more messed up he is, and how he's going to be helping create this Krytos virus, which is going to be not just a terrible disease to be inflicted on the planet and through the sewage system and all that, and definitely a book that reads a little bit more strongly with that plot line in a post-pandemic world. But yeah, I mean, it was insane to just see how dark and messed up he was from kind of being in that first book a little bit more of like that tactical, sensible monster who knew a little bit more about like the logistics of everything that he's doing and the traps that he's setting. So seeing Kirtan kind of be disgusted by like the extent that this man was going to, seeing what the virus was actually mutating and changing into. Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting trio of villainy there. I also liked seeing some of the Black Sun agents, and I like seeing how Fleury Voru kind of gets a little bit of a moment and starts building his way with both the New Republic and the Imperials, kind of playing both sides. So this is a book definitely dominated by the villains for me. But again, I still like Corran and what's going on with him. He's definitely in a bit of a triangle with Irisi and Mirax. The stuff with Mirax and him is sweet. I think this book definitely earns it way more than the first one ever does. The first one just kind of puts him in this crash course. This one, I feel like I saw things about both of them kind of unfolding and connecting. And you can see in the headspace that Corran is struggling with that, but he is also so determined to keep that going for him. And then Irisi is like everything about her should be working, right? But then it's just not. Something is off for him. And I mean, it's also definitely a bit weird how that romance is kind of kicked off with kind of the whole servant role that she's the pompous lady kind of making their way into Coruscant and seeing like that back and forth between the personas. Very interesting choice of and how to make that dynamic work, but it is also definitely one that I feel is very fitting for the storyline, and that's what causes a lot of initial confusion for Corran, which I thought was explored pretty well.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. The Corrin plotline, he's not as forefront this time as he was previously, but you still do get a lot of his important relationships clearly solidified throughout this novel. And I think where the book takes him towards the end, it's a pretty strong direction. Mirax has a lot of great work in here as well. The Arizi stuff, I think, also works quite well. And if you're reading this with no knowledge of where the rest of the series goes or where these characters go, I do think it's a relatively interesting love triangle that plays out between the three of them. And I think Stackpole does a solid job really fleshing that out. Gavin Darklighter is another character who I think improves here quite a bit. You get a lot more of him. He continues to evolve and grow and becomes a more layered character than he is in the previous book. But it is the villains and Coruscant. Like I was saying earlier, Coruscant's almost a character in this. You see so many different sides of Coruscant, the elite sides, but a lot of the underworld sides, the grosser sides, the more disturbing sides. And when the X-Wing series just in general focuses a lot on aliens versus humans, especially in a post-Empire world, you start to see a lot of those seeds sown here. You start to see a lot of the distrust and the things that ultimately play into not just the rest of the Rogue Squadron books, but also the Wraith Squadron books. There's a lot of commentary in these, and Wedge's Gamble does a great job of kind of kickstarting that. But Isard is menacing here, and in the way she starts to fully transform into the series' lead villain, she's really disturbing, and a lot of her plotting makes her one of the best villains in this entire series, and I did really appreciate where she goes. Wedge is also another standout, and Tycho, building up to the ultimate Tycho revelations, or maybe revelations by the end of this novel. You get a bit more of him, you get a bit more understanding of him, but you're also, the way Stackpole writes him and the things around him, there are still questions up in the air on what is going on with him and his plot point, and I thought Stackpole does a really strong job overall with that character as well. So the characters, to me, still very strong in this book, even if the plot does take more of a center stage. It's less about the characters this time and more about the reclamation of Coruscant, but the characters have to go through trials of their own and do things that craft them into ultimately the characters you see by the end of this series, that I do think are some of the strongest plot points and some of the strongest things they have to push through throughout the entirety of this series. So we're going to move into our final thoughts and a score out of 5 here. Sonic, what would you rate X-Wing Wedge's Gamble out of 5?
Yeah, I mean, I want to reiterate that this was the book that I struggled with the most of the four, but it still ended really strong for me. I think that's the whole point for me here is that the beginning was really, really interesting because you're finally switching us into a very interesting espionage story, and the final battle is tremendous. It is multi layered, it is everything that's been built up in the middle act. But the problem for me is I find a lot of the middle act kind of manufactured for that third book, and it is a lot of setup. And I think what takes away from the scope of Battle of Coruscant and kind of makes this book feel like a first half of a second half book to come, a first of two parts, and that's really what holds me back from pushing this much higher than Rogue Squadron. So I would put this at a 3.25 as well.
Yeah, for me, this is one of my favorite books in the X-Wing series. I really, really enjoy this book. Both slower pacing and all plot points here. It's hard to find a more interesting, compelling plot point in this series than the Reclamation of Coruscant. Characters, for me, still grow. And this is one of the darkest books, if not the single darkest book in the Rogue Squadron part of this series. I really do love this book. It's one of my favorites. I'm going to give this a full point higher. I'm going to give it a 4.25 out of 5. I really do love this book, and I hope you guys check it out. Let us know what your thoughts are down below. Have you read X-Wing Wedge's Gamble? Do you enjoy it as much as I did, or did you have some more problems with it like Sonic did? Let us know in the comments. If you've never read it, let us know if this review helped you out. Make sure you stay tuned for our reviews of the Krytos Trap and the Back to War. We will be having those released shortly. Thank you so much for watching this video, and we will see you all next time.